Hi, and welcome to Grasping Reason, a channel about history, philosophy and art. This time we're taking a look at Anaximander. Anaximander is the second person we will look at from the important trading hub and mother city of Miletus, on the western coast of the Anatolian Peninsula, an area of Greek settlements known as Ionia in the 6th century BCE. A precise date for each of Anaximander's activities is not known for certain, but we are told that he was 64 in 547-6 BC, so we can assume that everything he did was achieved in the decades before that point. Anaximander was the first philosopher for whom we have what appears to be a surviving fragment of his own work. You'd think that would make things easier, but compared to Thales, for whom we only had the testimonies of his biographers, it certainly does not, and I will discuss a number of the issues that we are presented with throughout the video. Other than that fragment, the majority of our knowledge of Anaximander also comes from testimonies by other ancient philosophers and biographers, and a large number of those testimonies tackle a concept that does not have an exact analogue in the English language. In Greek, the word is something like apeiron, and it is translated as either the infinite, the boundless, or the indefinite. We should bear in mind that when I use these terms they describe the same thing in Anaximander. I will mostly be using the terms apeiron or indefinite, but they mean the same thing. More will be said about this later, but for now, we will start with a look at the scientific discoveries that are commonly attributed to Anaximander. Diogenes Laertius stated that Anaximander was the first discoverer of the gnomon. A gnomon is basically the part of a sundial that points to the sky, used to measure the shadow of the sun, indicating its height, and it was certainly not first discovered by Anaximander. Egypt likely, and Babylon definitely, were already using these, and we can assume that Anaximander simply introduced their use to the Greeks. This assumption does jeopardise the story of the slightly earlier Thales measuring the height of the pyramids, as that feat would likely be with the same device, but we don't need to take the claim seriously in either case. The claim can help bolster the reputation of either thinker in the eyes of their biographers, but as we know it was used already by other civilizations, it really speaks more of the importance of Miletus as a hub for trade across the ancient world. This is true also of the other of Anaximander's scientific achievements. He is said, again by Diogenes Laertius, but others too, to be the first to have created a map. Now we have very little evidence, but it is widely believed. Type who made the first map into Google to find proof of that. I suggest you take it with a pinch of salt though, given the lack of evidence, but if any place was likely to be needing a written map, then it was certainly a place like Miletus. As well as the trade congregating in its markets from across the borders of neighbouring empires, Miletus also had a large number of its own colonies stretched across the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. So Miletus sounds like a place that could use a map. Now, let's take a look at this fragment that I mentioned earlier. It appears as a quotation in the works of the later thinker, Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle, and other quotations seem to derive from Theophrastus as a source. The full quote is stated quite clearly by Nietzsche in his Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, as such: "Where the source of things is, to that place they must also pass away, according to necessity. For they must pay penance and be judged with their injustices, in accordance with the ordinance of time." Now, the problem with this fragment is that while we can say with some certainty that Theophrastus is quoting from Anaximander here, we don't really know where Anaximander begins and ends. Kirk, Raven and Schofield note that there is an Aristotelian formulation of the fragment and its analysis that may not have been intended by Anaximander, and yet that is the basis for further study across the years. If you are studying the reliability of pre-socratic sources, then Anaximander is certainly going to give interesting insight. But if you are concerned with giving Anaximander's clear thoughts, then the dubious nature of our only fragment is a problem that we can't really overcome. Nevertheless, let's try and unpack what is said here. We can see that Anaximander believed in a source for the things constituent in our world, and that eventually those constituent things will in some way return to that source. There is a balance characterized by some concept of necessary justice that seems to ensure this return to the source. And finally, this process is ordered by time, The source of things is, when placed in the context of Theophrastus's analysis and the further testimonies by numerous authors, the indefinite, or apeiron. Despite Anaximander often being grouped with other thinkers of his time as a material monist, the apeiron appears not to be material at all. For Nietzsche, the translation of apeiron into the word indefinite was the only valid one, because it is a phenomena that escapes any precise definition. We'll return to more discussion on how to understand apeiron shortly, but I find Nietzsche's view to be pertinent here, as Anaximander is certainly not helping us to really understand what apeiron is in the fragment. We can view the return of things to apeiron as being the product of the penance and justice described in the preceding statement. The language suggests opposing forces, for whom a balance is maintained by means of some kind of arbiter, whether conscious or unconscious. When justice occurs, at least with an ideal concept of justice, we see the wronged party have their grievances redressed by a penance paid by the party who did them wrong. We see an effort towards balance between the parties so that neither the wrong nor the penance paid is outweighed. Anaximander was talking of the natural world, however, so we should try and put it in those terms. The encroachment of water onto fire will cause a quenching of fire so that it becomes diminished. We should expect a payment of penance by the water then, and perhaps we do, as the heating of the water causes an evaporation that also diminishes the body of water. Justice, for Anaximander, seems to be a way that the opposite components of the world are maintained in a balance, so that they do not become entirely overcome. Kirk, Raven and Schofield affirm that we are talking about the interplay of opposites here, with reference to other testimonies too, when they say, Anaximander is the first in whom the concept of opposed natural substances clearly appears. Doubtless he was influenced by observation of the main seasonal changes, in which heat and drought in summer seems to be pitted against cold and rain in winter. Now, you don't get to remove doubt simply by starting a sentence with the word doubtless, but there is a good reason to give the example of seasonal change. That being the final part of the fragment, that the interplay of justice between opposites is in accordance with the ordinance of time. Anaximander seems to be rejecting the idea of an instant rebalancing of phenomenal forces, and therefore we see that rebalancing taking place over an amount of time. For example, the injustice of summer has to be made good within the roughly equal period of winter. Within just a single fragment, we've managed to unpack a lot of meaning and perhaps become frustrated that we don't have a few more fragments that could clarify things further. Everything else we know of Anaximander is from the testimonies of other writers, and with those we build a slightly bigger picture of what Anaximander is talking about. I already gave Nietzsche's views on what apeiron means, and I must admit that it is the most compelling interpretation in my own eyes. You see, there had been many attempts by other writers to define the substance of apeiron, yet Anaximander gives us no such definition. But I have to admit that saying that we have some kind of thing from which material things are somehow generated, yet that thing is itself undefinable, well, that appears to be the death of inquiry. Is Anaximander saying that we can only go so far in understanding the world around us, up to the point of recognising the generation of material substance, but that there is a blocking incomprehensibility beyond that point? Perhaps this is why so many want to define apeiron anyway. A philosopher does not like to be told that they have reached the limit of their understanding. Aristotle certainly among them. From Aristotle we get a suggestion that apeiron is actually a substance between the states of two elements. If we imagine an understanding of the world that dictates fire, water, earth and air as fundamental elements, then apeiron would be a state of matter in between two of these fundamental elements. Kirk, Raven and Schofield highlight Aristotle's attribution of this intermediate to Anaximander, when they say, it looks as though Anaximander is meant as the proponent of an intermediate substance, not because he is directly named, but because this substance is implied to have been called simply apeiron. Perhaps it is this understanding of apeiron as existing between fundamental elements that allowed Aristotle to categorise Anaximander alongside the other Miletians as a material monist, But we have to recognise that it is Aristotle and not Anaximander that is turning a pairon into a material. As far as we know of Anaximander himself, he may well have rejected any such notion. Other translations of the word apeiron are infinite or boundless. Either of these words give a different character to what is provided by Anaximander than the word indefinite does. While indefinite tells us a thing has no definition, infinite tells us that a thing is not limited, boundless that it is not contained. These words offer a definition, even if that definition is that a thing may contain or be equatable to all things, or if it's some other definition. That is an application of attributes that the term indefinite rejects. And again, it must be stated that Anaximander himself offered no definitions. He himself offered no way for us to understand apeiron. In Kirk, Raven and Schofield, some pages are dedicated to the attributions of apeiron that other thinkers, particularly Aristotle, gave. I won't be treating them entirely here, but there is something that sticks out. From page 117, they say of the indefinite, it seems not improbable that he actually called it divine. It may be a more modern concept of the divine to regard a god as being beyond the full understanding of a human mind, but it felt fitting to me here, with my more modern concept of the divine in mind, that the analogy is drawn. Whatever the indefinite is, we know that it is fundamental to understanding Anaximander's cosmogony, his views on how the world came to be. As things stand, with only the single extant fragment, we can only refer to later writers to try and understand this process, and none are particularly enlightening on the matter. Kirk, Raven and Schofield discuss the subtly different interpretations found in Simplicius, Theophrastus and others on pages 127 to 133 of the Presocratic Philosophers, each being essentially that natural opposites are produced from the indefinite, by which we can assume that the world is then formed. The fragment certainly seems to suggest this, giving time as a mechanism for how. But that is far from a complete understanding of the process. If there is a divinity to the indefinite in Anaximander's mind, then perhaps that is sufficient explanation for him, but that is also never explicitly stated by Anaximander himself. The final point of Anaximander's work that I want to touch upon briefly is a small part of the cosmology that is attributed to him. If it is not enlightening, it is at least interesting. He apparently believed that the Earth was shaped like a cylinder, with a flat surface on top which constituted the Earth that we live upon. This cylinder is said to be supported by nothing, but has a central position between extremes. As Aristotle says, it is impossible for it to move simultaneously in opposite directions, so that it stays fixed by necessity. This is, well, certainly a little bizarre, but also a mathematical type of thinking that we just don't usually associate with the earliest philosophers. It leaves me wondering, yet again, just what Anaximander really said on this matter, and to what extent the idea was developed by him. It appears to me that the commentary of Anaximander is always shrouded behind the interpretation of him, like each commentator could not help put words in his mouth. How could they not when attempting to explain the thoughts of a man that lived centuries before them, and who has so little evidence of his work remaining? In many of those cases, however, what the writer tells us of Anaximander is likely to tell us more about that particular thinker. What all agree on is, I feel, what should be remembered most about Anaximander. He was the first philosophical writer that has, evidently, given us much to talk about when talking about him. Thank you for watching the video. As always, I would greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel and like the video. Please also leave a comment, perhaps telling me who your favourite Pokemon is. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video.